The wealth gap between homeowners and renters is not mainly about discipline. That's the lie people tell because it sounds fair.
Work hard. Save up. Buy a house. Build wealth.
If you're still renting, maybe you just haven't gotten serious yet. Maybe you spend too much. Maybe you want city life, flexibility, convenience, freedom. Maybe homeowners simply made better choices. That is the clean version. It is also, in a lot of cases, a deeply incomplete one. Because once you look at how the system actually works behind the curtain, you realize something more unsettling. Homeowners are not just living somewhere. They are standing inside a machine designed to quietly convert monthly housing costs into wealth. Renters, by contrast, are often standing outside that machine, paying for shelter while the machine runs for someone else. That is the real divide. And it gets worse over time, not because one side is morally better, but because the structure compounds. A renter and a homeowner can start on the same street, in the same city, earning similar incomes, raising similar children, shopping at the same stores, dealing with the same inflation headlines, and still drift into two completely different financial futures. Not because one of them is smarter. Because one of them is connected to an appreciating asset with fixed debt and tax advantages. The other is not. That's the whole story, and it's almost never told plainly enough. Imagine two people in their early 30s.
Same city. Same ballpark income.
Same vague hope that if they keep showing up for life and making decent choices, things will eventually stabilize. One rents a decent apartment for $2,300 a month. The other buys a modest home with a mortgage that, at least initially, feels a little uncomfortable but manageable. Both of them send thousands of dollars out every month for housing. On the surface, it looks similar.
Money leaves. Shelter remains.
Life continues. But under the surface, two very different systems are already at work. For the renter, that payment is a pure expense. Necessary, real, unavoidable, but gone. For the homeowner, that payment is split. Some disappears into interest, taxes, insurance, maintenance. But some quietly turns into equity. And the debt itself, if it's fixed rate, starts getting weaker over time while the house often gets more valuable. That is the first hidden mechanism. The homeowner's housing payment contains a wealth-building component, even when the owner does not feel wealthy at all. The renter's usually doesn't. This is why so many people misunderstand the housing gap. They think the story is appreciation. House goes up, owner gets richer. That's part of it, yes. But the real machine is more powerful than that. It is appreciation plus leverage plus fixed payment plus forced principal repayment plus tax advantages in some cases plus the social and political protection of housing scarcity. That's not one advantage. That's a stack. And once stacked advantages start compounding, the gap becomes very hard to close from the outside. Take leverage. This is where the system becomes almost unfair in slow motion. A renter saving cash might earn returns on whatever they manage to invest after rent, life, emergencies, and ordinary exhaustion have taken their share. A homeowner, meanwhile, gets exposure to the price movement of the entire property, not just the cash they personally put in. Put down 10% or 20% on a house, and if that house rises in value, the gain is happening on the whole asset. That is an extraordinary privilege hiding in plain sight. If someone buys a $400,000 home with $80,000 down and the house rises to $500,000, the asset gained $100,000. The owner didn't need to personally invest another $100,000 to access that growth. The leverage did the heavy lifting. Meanwhile, the renter may have been equally responsible, equally hardworking, equally employed, but unless they were investing aggressively and consistently despite rising rent, they were not plugged into that same kind of accelerated wealth effect. And then comes the second mechanism, payment stability. Renters live under a system of recurring repricing. Homeowners with fixed-rate mortgages often don't. That difference sounds technical until you live through 10 years of it. The renter signs a lease.
12 months pass.
Rent rises. Another year passes. Rent rises again. Maybe not catastrophically every time, but enough. Enough to keep reshaping the monthly budget. Enough to quietly eat raises. Enough to make long-term planning feel slightly fictional. Enough to make catching up with savings feel like trying to fill a bucket someone keeps widening. The homeowner, by contrast, may complain about taxes, insurance, repairs, HLA fees, sure. Homeownership is not some magical frictionless kingdom. But the mortgage principal and interest portion, if locked in at the right time, stays strikingly stable while wages, prices, and rents continue moving around it. That's enormous. Because over time, inflation starts working differently on each person. For the renter, inflation often means housing gets more expensive. For the homeowner with a fixed mortgage, inflation can mean the payment becomes relatively easier to carry while the asset value potentially rises.
Same inflation.
Different experience. This is why homeowners often feel richer later even if they didn't feel richer at the beginning. The system tilts in their favor over time. What once felt like a heavy payment becomes a lighter one relative to income and market rents. The house they stretched to buy becomes the thing that now protects them from stretching further. The renter doesn't get that transition. The renter gets repriced again.
And then again. And then again.
That is one of the least discussed forms of financial exhaustion in modern life. Not just paying for housing, but being continuously reintroduced to its current market value while someone else gets to age inside an old deal. That old deal is where a lot of wealth lives. Now add the third mechanism, scarcity protection. People like to talk about housing as if it were just a personal finance category.
It isn't.
It's also a political category, a local power category,
A zoning category.
a supply restriction category.
A cultural category.
In many desirable areas, homeowners are not merely benefiting from market luck. They are often protected by systems that limit new supply, preserve neighborhood exclusivity, and make ownership in established areas more valuable over time. That means the asset is not just appreciating because paint dries and families mow lawns. It is appreciating because scarcity is being defended.
Quietly. Legally. Politically. Relentlessly.
The renter, again, is outside that protective shell. The homeowner often gets the upside of constrained supply. The renter gets the consequence of constrained supply. That's why two people can live in the same city and one feels like the city is making them richer while the other feels like it is slowly pushing them out. Because that is, in effect, what is happening. And then there's the social psychology of ownership, which matters more than people admit. Homeownership forces certain behaviors that look wise in hindsight, even if they didn't feel elegant at the time. Owners tend to stay put longer because moving is expensive and annoying. They tend to preserve the asset because it's theirs. They tend to think longer term because the property itself rewards patience. In other words, the structure nudges them toward behavior that often aligns with wealth building. Renting can be perfectly rational. Sometimes it's even the smarter move, especially in expensive markets, transitional life stages, or when ownership costs are absurd relative to rent. But in practice, renting often exists in a softer psychological environment.
More mobility. More resets. More repricing. Less forced equity.
Less of that slow, boring accumulation that people only respect after 20 years have passed. The system does not reward mobility equally.
It says it does.
Culturally, we celebrate flexibility, freedom, optionality. Financially, the architecture often rewards rooted ownership far more. That's one of the harder truths here. A lot of renters are not losing because they are irresponsible. They are losing because they are playing a game in which housing remains a recurring cost instead of an asset-backed position. And once housing costs remain a cost rather than turning into equity, every other wealth-building goal becomes harder. Emergency savings harder. Retirement investing harder. Absorbing inflation harder. Starting a business harder. Taking a career risk harder. Even feeling psychologically stable becomes harder, because your largest monthly expense is still a moving target. That psychological piece matters. Stability is investable. Instability is expensive. A homeowner whose housing payment is predictable can often think further ahead. A renter facing uncertain renewals, possible moves, rising rent, broker fees, deposits, application processes, or landlord decisions is not just spending money. They are spending mental bandwidth. And financial systems quietly reward people who have more mental bandwidth left over. That's why this gap widens even when incomes don't look wildly different at first. One person gets a platform. The other gets a treadmill. Now, to be clear, none of this means every homeowner is winning or every renter is doomed. Plenty of homeowners buy too much house, overpay at the wrong time, drown in maintenance, or lock themselves into fragile lives that only look successful from the street. Plenty of renters invest the difference intelligently, avoid bad markets, preserve flexibility, and build wealth in other ways. But that exception is not the dominant pattern. The dominant pattern is that ownership gives ordinary people access to extraordinary wealth mechanics disguised as domestic life. That's why the issue becomes so emotionally charged. Because people think they're arguing about personal choice when they're often arguing about access to compounding structures. The homeowner is not just buying a kitchen and a roof. They are often buying a hedge against future housing inflation, a leveraged appreciating asset, a forced savings vehicle, a more stable monthly cost structure, and eventually, in many cases, a lower housing burden later in life. The renter is usually buying one thing. time in the unit. Nothing wrong with that. But it is a different financial experience entirely. And when these two lives continue for 10, 15, 20 years, the divergence gets cruel. The homeowner may be sitting on hundreds of thousands in equity almost accidentally. Not because they studied macroeconomics. Not because they were brilliant. Because they got inside the system early enough, or at least earlier, and stayed there long enough for the machinery to do what it does. The renter may have paid just as much, sometimes more, in total monthly outflow over the years and still have little to show for it beyond having been housed. That creates a very particular kind of resentment in modern economies. Because from the renter's point of view, they did participate. They paid constantly. They were financially obedient. They upheld their side of the arrangement every single month. And yet the arrangement did not reward them with ownership, leverage, appreciation, or payment stability. It rewarded them with permission to keep paying. That is why the wealth race feels so brutal. Renters are not just failing to catch up. They are often funding a system that keeps making catch-up harder. Sometimes quite literally. Their rent helps cover the mortgage on a building or property portfolio owned by someone else. Their city becomes more expensive because ownership is already entrenched. Their savings goal moves farther away because prices rise faster than down payments can be accumulated. Their monthly payment remains sensitive to market conditions while owners continue operating from older, better terms. This is how the gap becomes self-reinforcing. Wealth buys access to ownership. Ownership builds more wealth. More wealth buys better ownership positions. Those positions become harder for outsiders to enter. That's not just a market pattern. That's a class escalator. And the escalator is moving upward for one group while the stairs keep steepening for the other. This is also why the usual advice to renters often feels insulting. Just save more. Cut expenses. Move somewhere cheaper. Delay gratification. As if the central issue were one or two behavioral tweaks. No. Behavior matters, but structure matters more. If home prices are running away from wages, if rents are consuming down payment capacity, if interest rates spike, if supply remains constrained, if investor ownership expands in key markets, if local rules protect incumbents, then the renter is not merely failing at discipline. The renter is trying to buy into an asset system whose entry price is moving faster than their ability to accumulate admission. And once that happens, the race begins to look rigged not in the theatrical sense, but in the quiet, administrative sense. The most powerful wealth-building system available to middle-income families is often home equity. So what happens when more people get locked out of it for longer? They don't just delay a purchase. They delay their entry into compounding. That delay has consequences. A homeowner who bought at 32 and sells or refinances or simply continues owning at 52 may have an entirely different net worth than a renter who finally enters at 45, even if the renter had solid income and decent habits the whole time. The years matter. The payment stability matters. The appreciation window matters. The debt paydown matters. This is why the gap doesn't merely exist. It widens. Because the homeowners who already got in are not standing still. Their equity may keep growing while renters are still trying to outrun rising rent and rising purchase prices at the same time. That is a vicious combination. The renter is chasing a moving house with shrinking cash flow. The homeowner is already attached to the asset. And the attachment itself is what grows more valuable. That, more than anything, is the insider truth. Wealth and housing is often not about superior monthly skill. It's about being connected to the right side of a long-duration asset while the system inflates around it. Which is why the phrase starter home has started sounding almost nostalgic. In a healthier system, a first home is an entry point. In a harsher system, that same first home becomes a drawbridge. If you crossed early enough, the appreciation helps lift you. If you didn't, each year can make the bridge harder to reach. So yes, homeowners keep getting richer while many renters struggle. Not because owners are saints. Not because renters are fools. Not because the difference is all avocado toast and bad priorities. But because one side is plugged into leverage, appreciation, payment stability, scarcity, and equity accumulation, while the other side is often absorbing rising housing costs without ownership of the thing getting more expensive. One group pays and slowly owns. The other pays and must begin again next month. That is why renters are falling further behind. And unless more people understand that this is a structural story, not just a personal virtue story, the conversation will keep getting distorted. We will keep moralizing outcomes that are heavily shaped by access, timing, financing, and the design of local housing markets. The homeowner is not just living in the house. They are living inside the wealth engine. The renter is often standing just outside it, hearing the noise, paying the heat, and wondering why the race feels impossible no matter how fast they run.